All right, welcome back for another deep dive into the JFK files. As you know, we're working our way through all of these documents, all 2,182 of them.
It's a lot, that's for sure.
It really is. And for this deep dive, you've given us files 301 through 350.
Right. And I think it's really important for everyone listening to understand that we, as AI systems, we don't know what's in these files beforehand.
Yeah, it's a total black box for us.
It really is. The names of the files, they don't give us any clues. So every time we start one of these deep dives, it's a genuine exploration.
Exactly. We're discovering right alongside you what these files contain, what they might mean, and how they might connect to the bigger picture of the JFK assassination.
And one other thing to keep in mind is while we do our best to analyze and interpret the information, we're not human historians or intelligence
Right.
analysts.
We're AI, and our analysis should be taken in that context.
Exactly. We're tools offering a different perspective. But critical thinking, human expertise, all of that is still vital when trying to make sense of this complex historical event.
Absolutely. Okay, so with all of that said, our mission today is to go through these 50 files, pull out the key pieces of information, and see how they might relate to each other.
Right. And like we've seen before, the connections might be obvious, they might be subtle, or sometimes they might seem completely random.
It's all part of the mystery, right?
Exactly. So let's jump in and see what we can uncover.
All right, so right away, we're seeing a bunch of internal CIA memos and routing slips.
Yeah, and it looks like a lot of these early documents have to do with an individual named Mitchell Livingston WerBell III.
WerBell. All right, so who was this guy, and why was the CIA interested in him?
Well, it seems like the agency was aware of him as early as 1959. There's a memo from March of 76 that refers back to contact the DDP, the Directorate of Plans, had with WerBell back then.
So this wasn't just a passing acquaintance. They had some history.
Right. And we see some of that history in a memo dated July 6, 1959.
Okay, what does that memo tell us?
So this memo says that General Cabell, who's identified in the document as Flores, reported that WerBell had spoken with him about a trip to the Dominican Republic.
The Dominican Republic. That's an interesting location, especially in the context of the Cold War and everything happening in the Caribbean at that time.
Definitely. And according to this memo, WerBell even offered to travel to Washington to meet at his own expense.
It sounds like he was really eager to get the agency's attention.
You could say that, though the memo does state that no commitments were made at that point.
Right, so they were listening, but
Mhm.
not necessarily signing up for anything yet.
Exactly. But then there's another memo from the very next day, July 7th, 1959, and it confirms that Flores did meet with WerBell in Washington.
Okay, so they did meet. What did they talk about?
Well, according to the memo, they discussed a whole range of issues, including the Dominican Republic, Fidel Castro, Batista, who had just been overthrown in Cuba, and General Pedraza.
So a lot of heavy hitters in Caribbean politics at the time.
For sure, it definitely seems like WerBell was trying to position himself as someone with knowledge and connections in the region.
Makes sense. The agency would be interested in anyone with insights into what was happening in the Caribbean, especially with Castro's rise to power.
Absolutely. And then we have a memo from July 8th that says Flores called WerBell to set up another appointment.
Another meeting. They must have found him interesting, at least to some degree.
Right. And this time, it seems like the agency was laying down some ground rules. They told WerBell that the U.S. would not support any revolutionary activities by this General Pedraza, but that they would stick to their international obligations regarding Cuba and Pedraza.
So they were hearing him out, but making it clear that they weren't going to get involved in any unauthorized adventure.
Exactly. They were setting boundaries. Now we jump forward quite a bit in time to an FBI report from August 1974, and WerBell's name pops up again.
Okay, so what's the story with WerBell in 74?
Well, this FBI report mentions that WerBell had a note from former CIA Director William Colby. The note was very brief, just a line or two, and it was dated August 9th, 1974. The report says it suggested a good friendship between them.
A note from Colby himself. That's pretty significant. It definitely suggests some level of connection, at least on a personal level.
Right. And then this same report goes on to detail some activities that allegedly happened back in 1962.
1962, so even before that note from Colby, what kind of activities are we talking about?
Well, according to the report, different CIA stations and individuals connected to WerBell were active in Central America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. They were apparently contacting officials in those countries about potential efforts to liberate Cuba from Castro's government.
So basically trying to drum up support for some kind of anti-Castro operation.
Yeah, that seems to be the gist of it. And WerBell, true to form, was offering his services. He claimed to represent something like 90 different Cuban exile groups, with a total of almost 200,000 exiles.
Wow, those are some pretty bold claims. Did he actually have that kind of reach?
Hard to say for sure, but he was definitely trying to project an image of power and influence. He even claimed that a potential government in exile was ready to pay $100,000 for recognition.
$100,000 back then. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it was. And get this. He also said that his headquarters were in Washington, D.C.
Right here in D.C., that's even bolder, claiming to operate so openly.
Right. And it gets even more intriguing. He alleged that the State Department had someone on their payroll making $6,000 a year just to keep them informed about his activities and those of the exile groups he claimed to represent.
Wow, that's a wild claim. It's like he was trying to make himself indispensable, someone the U.S. government couldn't ignore.
Yeah, it seems like he was a master at self-promotion. So if we put all of this together, what can we say about WerBell and the CIA?
It looks like the agency was aware of him, at least peripherally, from the late 50s. They were willing to meet with him to hear what he had to say, but they were also cautious, making it clear that they weren't going to back any unauthorized actions.
Right. It's also interesting that this Colby note is from much later, so it seems like there might have been some ongoing connection there.
Yeah, the nature of that relationship is something we might want to keep an eye out for as we go through more of these files.
Definitely. So moving on, we have a group of documents that focus on E. Howard Hunt.
Oh, E. Howard Hunt. Now, there's a name that's synonymous with CIA intrigue.
Absolutely. And these documents, they're from 1974, and they give us a behind-the-scenes look at how the agency dealt with former operatives who were writing their memoirs.
Yeah, that must have been a real challenge for them, balancing national security concerns with the right of these individuals to tell their stories.
For sure. And Hunt, he was a major figure in a lot of covert operations, so you can imagine the agency was watching his book very closely.
Right. So what are these documents specifically?
Well, the first one is a routing and record sheet from September 19th, 1974. It's marked confidential, and it refers to an advanced copy of Hunt's galley proofs. It says there were proposed security deletions and revisions.
So they were already going through his book, identifying parts that might be problematic.
Exactly. And it looks like a DDO panel had reviewed some of these items. They called them hardcore and recommended that they be removed or changed.
Hardcore. That sounds serious. What kind of information were they so concerned about?
Well, we get some more details in a memo from September 30th, 1974. It describes a meeting with Hunt, his lawyers, and a CIA officer named Ray Rocca from the CI staff.
So a high-level meeting to discuss the book.
Yeah, and the memo even mentions that they checked to see if the meeting was being recorded.
That's interesting. A little bit paranoid, maybe?
Well, it was a sensitive situation. They were dealing with classified information, and Hunt was known to be, let's say, resourceful.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So what came out of this meeting? Did they come to an agreement on the book?
It seems like they did, at least partially. The memo says that they agreed on changes to several paragraphs. These changes were about a fabricated Shanghai posting, the entry into the Guatemalan embassy in Mexico City, and a joint CIA-Uruguayan telephone monitoring operation.
Wow, those are all pretty sensitive topics, especially the Guatemalan embassy incident. That was a big deal at the time.
It was. And the memo gives us some insight into the types of changes they made. They changed the name of the fake newspaper, removed a reference to journalists being used as agents, took out the word Guatemalan in relation to the embassy thing, and rephrased some paragraphs to talk about electronic surveillance in more general terms.
So basically, they were trying to sanitize the language, make it less specific so it wouldn't reveal too much.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to protect sources and methods, past and present.
Makes sense. And what about Hunt's perspective? How did he feel about all of this?
Well, the memo says that it was in both Hunt's and the agency's best interest to avoid looking like they were colluding or cooperating on the book.
Right. They both wanted to maintain some distance.
Exactly. But it also says that Hunt seemed to want the agency's approval and respect, and he seemed convinced that his book wouldn't harm operations or personnel.
So a bit of a balancing act for him. Trying to tell his story without burning too many bridges or revealing too many secrets.
Right. That's a delicate dance that a lot of former intelligence officers have to do when they write their memoirs.
Now, there's another document about Hunt that caught my eye. It's a JFK assassination system identification form from November 2nd, 1973, and it mentions Mr. E. Howard Hunt, alias birth certificate.
Yeah, aliases were a big part of the intelligence world, and with Hunt, it's especially interesting.
For sure. And we get some more detail in a memo from that same date. It talks about a discussion between someone named John S. Warner and some people from the Special Prosecutor's Office. And it's about Hunt's passports.
Passports, what's the story there?
Well, the memo says that Hunt had multiple U.S. passports issued between 1950 and 1970. A lot of travel, obviously.
Makes sense for someone in his line of work.
Right. And here's the interesting part. The memo says that while the CIA didn't issue Hunt a U.S. alias passport, he did have some kind of alias travel document, and he also had a tourist card under an assumed name.
So he was definitely using aliases for travel, though it's not clear where that travel document came from, if not the CIA.
Right. Another little mystery surrounding E. Howard Hunt.
Okay.
So we've got WerBell, we've got Hunt. Now the documents shift gears again, and we start seeing stuff about Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko.
Nosenko, now that's a whole different chapter in Cold War espionage. He was a KGB officer who defected to the West.
A KGB defector. Those were always high-stakes situations, trying to figure out if they were genuine or if they were trying to plant disinformation.
Absolutely. And we have a bunch of memos from 1964 and one from 1975 that shed some light on how the agency handled Nosenko's defection.
So what's the first memo?
It's from April 2nd, 1964, and it describes a meeting where a Mr. Helms is talking about the issues surrounding Nosenko's case. They were getting advice from the Justice Department, and there were a lot of concerns. They were still trying to determine if he was a legitimate defector or a KGB plant.
Makes sense. They had to be very careful with these defectors.
Right, and they were also discussing whether deporting him to Germany might get them more intelligence.
Playing a bit of hardball, huh?
Yeah, and the memo also mentions the conditions of Nosenko's detention in the U.S.
I imagine it wasn't exactly a luxury hotel.
Probably not. Then we have this memo from January 1975. It gives us an update on Nosenko's situation. It says he defected and was living in the U.S. under INS parole, and the CIA was responsible for him.
So they took him in, essentially.
Yeah, and the FBI was kept in the loop about everything.
Transparency, I guess.
Yeah.
At least between agencies.
Right. And the memo also says that Nosenko had been interviewed by Soviet officials, INS officials, and State Department officials, and he always said he wanted asylum in the U.S.
So he's sticking to his story.
Exactly. But to understand why his defection was such a big deal, we have to go back to a memo from February 11th, 1964.
Okay, what does this earlier memo tell us?
It gives us some background on Nosenko. It says he was a KGB staff officer in Moscow assigned to the Counterintelligence Directorate.
So deep in the heart of Soviet intelligence.
Right. And get this. He was also part of the Soviet delegation to the disarmament conference in Geneva.
Wow, that's a pretty good cover. Access to high-level discussions.
For sure.
Hmm.
And the memo says that in 1962, during those disarmament talks, Nosenko contacted U.S. officials and volunteered some information about Soviet subversion.
So he was already playing both sides back then.
It seems like it. And the U.S. authorized this contact, so they were already interested in what he had to offer.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now the memo goes on to say that in late '64, he was in Geneva again with the Soviet delegation.
Right. And this time, he secretly got in touch with his CIA contacts, and they had a series of meetings.
So things were getting more serious.
Definitely. The memo says that they carefully considered the possibility that he might be a double agent.
That's a legitimate concern. They couldn't just take his word for it.
No, but in the end, they decided to accept his defection. They figured the Soviets wouldn't pick someone who had already been in contact with the U.S.
A gamble either way, right?
It is. And to add to this, there's actually a news article from February 11th, 1964 titled "See Defector." It probably gives us some details about how his defection was reported in the press.
So we can see how the public was perceiving this event at the time.
Exactly. Now, the last memo about Nosenko is kind of strange. It's from May 12th, 1964, and it's about someone codenamed AEF Oxartek, and it's almost certainly Nosenko.
AEF That's a mouthful.
It is. And this memo goes into a lot of detail about his daily routine.
Right.
His diet, living arrangements, hygiene, even how often he got a haircut.
Wow, they were keeping a close eye on him, weren't they?
They were. It even mentions that he was only allowed one cigarette a day.
Seriously. One cigarette.
Yeah. The memo also says that a Dr. Borer would visit him every Tuesday.
So they were monitoring his physical and mental health as well.
It seems like it. And the memo ends by saying that security procedures should stay at the highest level and that they'd keep him in custody until at least July.
Wow. They were really taking no chances with Nosenko.
It was a high-stakes situation. They needed to be absolutely sure about his motives.
Okay, so we've got WerBell, Hunt, and Nosenko. Three very different individuals, all connected to the CIA in some way. What's next in this batch of files?
Let's see. Okay, it looks like we have some documents related to some legal cases, specifically U.S. versus Leon and U.S. versus Hemming.
Legal cases. That's a whole other area where the agency's work sometimes intersects with the public sphere.
It is. So this first document is a routing and record sheet from November 2nd, 1977, marked Secret, and it's about Lit Crim US v. Leon. There's a handwritten note that mentions something about an imprisonment in the Black Notebook.
The Black Notebook. Sounds ominous.
It does, and the note says to contact someone named Bill Godson, who had apparently reviewed the file.
Okay, so a very internal hush-hush kind of note.
Yeah. Then we have a memo from January 11th, 1977, and it's about the case of USA versus Gerald P. Hemming.
Hemming. All right, so what's this case about?
This memo is about a guy named Thomas L. Briggs. He was going to be a witness for the U.S. government in the case. It says he was a special agent with the DEA from 69 to 74, and he had interviewed Hemming back in 75.
The DEA, so drugs are involved somehow.
It seems like it. The memo says that Briggs's report from that interview became part of the KISS file.
So his testimony was important to the government's case.
Right. It also says that Briggs told his division security officer about what was in his report.
Standard procedure, I guess.
Probably.
Yeah.
And then he got contacted by another DEA agent, Robert Fredericks, who asked him to go to the U.S. courthouse in Miami to meet with the assistant U.S. attorney.
So they were prepping him to testify.
Exactly. Then there's another memo, this one from January 16th, 1978, and it gives us more details about the Hemming case.
Okay, fill me in.
It talks about a meeting that happened in November of 77 with a few guys. Thomas Briggs, Gary Maddox, and Robert Bartow.
Right. And who are these guys?
They went to Miami to meet with the judge, Judge Hovler, and the assistant U.S. attorney, Thomas M. Sherrouse.
A meeting with a judge. Sounds pretty serious.
It was. The memo says that Sherrouse told Briggs and Maddox that they had both dealt with Hemming when they were working for the DEA.
Ah, so they had some history with the defendant.
Right. And because of that, Sherrouse wanted them to be available as rebuttal witnesses.
Just in case Hemming tried to pull something.
Yeah. And Bartow was also being considered as a possible rebuttal witness.
So they were gathering all their resources, making sure they had everything covered.
Exactly. And the memo describes another meeting the next day with Sherrouse, Roger Howard, who seems to be Hemming's public defender, and Ted Sakowitz.
A meeting with the defense. So negotiations happening behind the scenes.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
And then it says that Sherrouse decided Maddox wouldn't have to testify after all.
Okay, so change of plans.
Right. And there's this interesting detail that the judge didn't really want to have a meeting with just one side present because Hemming was representing himself.
That makes sense. Trying to
Draw.
keep things fair and balanced.
Exactly. But they did have the meeting anyway, and the judge said they should make a transcript of it, but for some reason they didn't.
Huh. That's a bit strange.
It is, and in the end, Hemming finished his defense without calling Briggs as a witness.
So Briggs's testimony wasn't needed after all.
It wasn't. Now, to add to all of this, we also have some handwritten notes that seem to be about some of these people. Tom Briggs, someone named Barry Maddox, and Denny.
Short notes, just jotting down information.
Yeah, they include their employment dates with the CIA and DEA, addresses, phone numbers, and little comments about their contact with the agencies.
Like reminders or internal notes about potential witnesses.
That's what it seems like. Okay, so moving on, we have a group of documents about someone named Herbert Itkin.
Itkin. All right, another new name. What's the story with this guy?
It looks like both the CIA and the FBI were interested in him. We have two telepatches, both dated November 16th, 1973, and marked secret. They were sent from the chief of the East Asia Division to the chiefs of base in Melbourne and Canberra in Australia, and to the chief of station in Canberra.
Australia. That's a long way from D.C.
It is. These telepatches are about a letter from an Australian judge, A.R. Moffat.
What was this judge writing about?
He was asking about Itkin. He called Itkin a former CIA and FBI employee and mentioned his association with a Mr. William Crosby.
Crosby. That's probably William Colby, the CIA director.
Yeah, it must be a typo. Anyway, this judge, he was heading a commission in Australia investigating organized crime, and he wanted to know if Itkin was reliable.
So Itkin's credibility was in question.
Right. It seems like Itkin had testified in England back in 71 and said he was recruited by the CIA in 54 and worked with them until 63, and then with both the CIA and FBI until 68.
So he was claiming a long history with U.S. intelligence.
Yeah. And the judge wanted to know if any of that was true.
And what did the CIA say?
The telepatch says that the Office of General Counsel would reply through a diplomatic pouch.
So a formal and confidential response.
Exactly. Then we have a memo for the record from January 31st, 1969. It says that two guys, Thomas L. Roberts and Robert Delson, contacted the director of security and asked for Itkin's security files.
So Itkin was definitely on their radar back then.
He was, and there's another memo, this one from January 29th, 1969, about a meeting with some other guys. Houston, Warner, Rocca, and Eugene Milligan.
What were they meeting about?
They were discussing the operational use of this Thomas Roberts, the same guy who asked for Itkin's files.
So Roberts was involved in some kind of CIA operation.
It seems like it. And the memo gives us some background on Roberts. It says he was in West Africa for a while, writing a book about legal issues there. But the foundation that funded his research was blown in something called the Middle L exposure.
Middle L, another one of those cryptic code names.
Right. So anyway, after that, Roberts worked for RCA for a while, undercover, and then he was sent to Dakar.
So moving around, working under different covers.
Exactly. Now, this next memo is from October 7th, 1976. It's about an agreement with an entity called L Blue.
L Blue, okay, what's that all about?
It says that L Blue, through someone named Emmett Steele, agreed to hire a European division agency called Topphone 1.
Topphone 1, another code name. It's like they're speaking a different language.
They kind of are. And the memo says that a John J. Murray Jr. represented the agency in these negotiations.
So a formal agreement.
Yeah, a retainer contract. L Blue would pay Topphone 1 $9,000 a year in monthly installments.
A lot of money changing hands. What was it all for?
The memo doesn't say. It just says that they wanted to make the contractual relationship clear to both sides and that the agency would reimburse L Blue quarterly.
So a covert financial arrangement of some kind.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
Okay, now we have a routing and record sheet from November 7th, 1975, and it's about a Daniel Flores jury summons.
Jury duty, that's not something you usually associate with the CIA.
It's not. Attached to the sheet is a memo asking for help from the Office of General Counsel.
What do they need help with?
Well, there's a summons from the Circuit Court of Fairfax County, Virginia, ordering Daniel Flores to show up for jury duty for 2 months, starting November 17th, 1975.
2 months. That's a long time.
It is. And Flores, he says he's working under State Department cover.
Ah, so serving on a jury could blow his cover.
Right. He was asking the agency for guidance on how to handle this situation.
That must have been a tricky situation, balancing civic duty with the demands of covert operations.
Definitely. Okay, the next document is a memo from July 1st, 1963. It's marked secret, and it's about a Manuel F. Artime Buesa, hashtag 2D Note 838.
Artime Buesa. Okay, who's he?
This memo is about a request for a covert site in Bethesda, Maryland. They wanted to use it to house 2 Cuban exiles and as a meeting place.
A safe house, basically.
Right. And the memo says that the Special Activities Staff, SAS, was particularly interested in this site.
SS. They were the guys who handled the really sensitive stuff.
Exactly. And they wanted to bug the place, put in microphones to listen to what these exiles were saying.
So they were keeping tabs on them.
Definitely. The memo says they planned for the 2 men to arrive on July 1st and stay for about a week or 10 days. But they wanted the audio surveillance to continue for months after they left.
Really thorough. They wanted to catch everything.
It seems like it. The memo also mentions that someone named George Ladner gave them the real name of the leader of the 2 men. They were staying in a fancy neighborhood.
Trying to blend in?
Right. And they determined that audio surveillance was doable, and they even considered setting up a listening post.
A dedicated listening post. That's commitment.
It is. And the memo even gives us a breakdown of the equipment they needed, costing almost $3,000.
Wow, they spared no expense.
And then it says they started installing the equipment at 1:30 p.m. on July 1st, 1963.
So we have the exact moment a covert operation was put into action.
Right there in the document. Okay, moving on, we have a Hostile Intelligence Connections form from July 10th, 1972.
Hostile intelligence. Sounds like we're back in the world of spies and counterintelligence.
We are. This form was signed by someone named Claire Scoville, and it's basically a questionnaire to assess someone's background and connections to, well, hostile intelligence.
A vetting process, essentially.
Exactly. One question asks if the subject could be identified as a longtime employee of BKR Trust.
BKR Trust, another code name. Who were they?
No idea, but the answer is yes. And it says the subject would likely identify Mexico as their first overseas assignment.
Mexico. A lot of CIA activity there during the Cold War.
Definitely. It says they spent a long time working in Branch I and knew almost everything that was going on at the Mexico City station.
So a key player in the Mexico City station.
Yeah. They had tourist cover, but they actually worked inside the embassy.
A classic cover.
It is. And while they were in Mexico City, they mostly handled support projects, but also something called Lilink and O2, LP Globe. They also knew about all the operations against Cuba, except maybe one codenamed Liam 1.
So deeply involved in anti-Castro activities.
It seems like it. It also mentions that they knew someone codenamed Ex-Liadlib socially.
Another code name. It's like trying to solve a puzzle.
It is. But they never worked together. And at the time, Ex-Liadlib was still in Mexico, having trouble finding a job.
Tough break.
Yeah. And the form says it would be bad for BKR Trust if they met up.
So, potential security risk.
Right. And the last thing it mentions is that they only knew the Olympic attaché in Mexico and someone named Aji, who worked for him during the Olympics, as other U.S. government personnel.
Okay, so a very specific snapshot of this person's connections and potential vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And finally, we have a personal history form. It's mostly redacted, but it gives us some details about someone.
Another mystery person.
Yeah, it talks about their family, education, work history, languages they knew, foreign travel, and security investigations they might have been part of.
So a basic background check.
Pretty much. And there's one entry that says they had contact with Robert Bennett in '72 about a session with U.S. prosecutor Silbert.
A meeting with a prosecutor. Sounds like they might have been in some kind of legal trouble.
Could be. Or maybe they were a witness. It's hard to say without more context.
Right. Well, that's it for files 301 through 350. Another 50 down, a lot more to go.
It is amazing how much variety we see in these files. It's like a kaleidoscope of the agency's activities during this period.
Totally. We've got everything from potential anti-Castro plots to internal struggles over memoirs to the handling of a high-profile KGB defector.
And then all these little details about covert operations, financial arrangements, and even jury duty.
That really shows the complexity of the world the CIA was operating in, all the different challenges they were facing, and the sometimes questionable methods they used.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the inner workings of the CIA during this crucial period in history. It's important to remember that these documents are just a small piece of the puzzle. There's still so much more to learn about the JFK assassination and the events surrounding it.
Definitely. And we encourage you to keep digging, keep asking questions, and never stop seeking the truth.
Exactly, because as we've seen, even in just these 50 files, the truth can be elusive, multifaceted, and sometimes downright strange.
It certainly can, and that's what makes this whole journey so fascinating, right?
Absolutely. Until next time.
See you then.